Welcome to the Inclusive Leadership Coaching Podcast. I'm Terry Donahue, your neurospicy inclusion coach. I am an ICF PCC life and leadership coach, passionate about social justice and specializing in neurodiversity. My purpose on this journey is to partner with you as you build an inclusive coaching practice that expands your impact. Here on the Inclusive Leadership Coaching Podcast, we believe leadership isn't just about titles or positions of power. It's about behavior, collaboration, and creating real, inspiring change. So let's get to it. Hey, leaders. So last week, we explored the power of self-reflection and reflecting on our bias, and how understanding our bias can strengthen our coaching practice in a world that so often feels uncertain and definitely divided right now. I had planned to dive into the right to comfort this week, but I kind of have to pivot. And honestly, I'm excited about this shift. I am easily excitable. The response from so many of you was really incredible. You see, coaches, a lot of you reached out. I love it to hear from my community and wanting to go deeper, not just into bias awareness, but it was something even more personal and maybe urgent. Emotional dysregulation in neurodivergence. See, we're talking about big emotional waves that can hit kind of fast for some of us, sometimes without even warning. And when emotions become so intense, they overwhelm sometimes people's coping strategies. So today, we are diving into what I am going to call this episode inclusive emotional intelligence in coaching, and what it means for us as leadership coaches when we take all brains into account. You see, traditional emotional intelligence models often assume a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation, to awareness, and to emotional control. It's not just a soft skill, emotional intelligence. It is a strength. But if we're truly committed to inclusion, we have to ask this question together. Who gets left out of these models? So throughout our journey today, we're exploring three key ideas. We're going to look at how different brains process emotions, why emotional intensity can be a leadership strength, and how inclusive coaching personalizes emotional intelligence approaches rather than expecting conformity. I don't know. I feel as if every time I say conformity, we need to drink our tea. It's like one of those words I use a lot being an inclusive coach. Let's redefine what it means to navigate emotions in leadership coaching. Not just for some, but for all of us. So this shift in focus led me to start reflecting on my time. I did an extended learning DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion course at UBC, the University of British Columbia, where it was on leadership coaching. It had us unpack our own cultural identities and exploring the roles we play as leaders. I always reference this one course. It was actually pretty impactful and educational for me. So it was there during this course that I learned about emotional intelligence, also known as EQ, and I began to question the differences in brain function and how I showed up as a neurodivergent leader, navigating spaces that aren't built for me, that aren't able to handle my type of honesty and passion. You see, many traditional domains of EQ appear to assume neurotypical ways of processing emotions and neurotypical ways of communicating and even making decisions. I'm doing air quotes for typical, since there is no real normal. So this is totally where we encounter our first insight. Different brains process emotions differently. This reminds me of a time where I was doing an inclusive emotional intelligence training with some senior leadership team. One of the members of this training shared how they would become so overwhelmed sometimes during high pressure situations that they needed to physically leave the room to regain their composure. And then there was another leader who described feeling emotion so intensely that someone saying, "Oh, take a deep breath," actually felt really dismissive to them. So what these two leaders experienced weren't failures of emotional control. They're just different neurological experiences of emotions that traditional leadership models rarely acknowledge. For many folks, whether they're neurodivergent or not, feelings can sometimes hit like a tidal wave. Fast, intense, and sometimes overwhelming. You can be easily excited. Irritability can happen from overwhelm. Who knows what? It could be sensory, the environment, like I've said before. And even rejection sensitivity can cause this, where feedback can cut deeper than it might for others. These are all real parts of the experience of some neurodivergent individuals. We also need to talk about alexithymia. See, alexithymia is a condition where some people struggle with even identifying and describing their own emotions. Research suggests it affects roughly 5 to 10% of the general population, but definitely appears more frequently in neurodivergent communities. I've worked with some brilliant leaders who can absolutely bust out some business concepts and struggle to name how they're feeling. Come on, coaches, you know you've been there. But they're not emotionally unintelligent. They're experiencing emotions through different neurological lenses. So, this is why we wanted to bring this conversation into our coaching space. Because as coaches, working with all types of leaders, we need to see both the gaps and the opportunities together. Emotional intensity can be a leadership strength, not a weakness. A common misconception about emotional intelligence is that it means suppressing emotions, presenting a calm exterior. In reality, emotional intelligence isn't about hiding our emotions, though. It's about understanding them and being intelligent about our emotions, expressing them and expressing them accordingly. For those of us in coaching roles, we might benefit from exploring our relationship with emotions. I have some journaling prompts if you're interested. By asking ourselves, how was our emotional landscape shaped? What unspoken rules about emotional expression did you internalize growing up? Another journaling prompt would be, what gets missed when we don't see emotional intensity as a leadership asset? You see, big emotions aren't just reactions. They can be sources of innovation, deep honesty and truth, deep empathy, and really transformational leadership. When we don't account for this, leaders may be encouraged to tone down or shrink rather than developing emotional intelligence in ways that align with their unique strengths. Studies show that when men express anger, it often is interpreted as he's assertive, confident, a real take charge kind of guy. But when women express these same similar emotions, it's viewed differently. Sometimes being actually dismissed as emotional or irrational, hormonal. Okay, don't get me started. And research on intersectionality highlights how cultural bias shape perceptions of emotional expression. For instance, like I was speaking about in the last episode on the division of the world right now, in American culture, certain emotional expressions may be viewed as assertive and a passionate debate, while for others, the same expression are often labeled as aggressive due to stereotypes. See, all of these bias can create invisible barriers for authentic leadership. They can force people into rigid emotional boxes that don't allow for the full spectrum of the human experience, which is exactly what true emotional intelligence should be embracing. If we move beyond the idea that emotions must always be controlled and instead see them as valuable leadership tools, then the next step is figuring out how to develop emotional intelligence that honor each leader's unique experience. And that brings us to the third insight. I think I'm doing it. So our third key insight is that inclusive leadership coaching means personalizing emotional intelligence approaches rather than expecting uniform standards for everyone. For instance, in my coaching practice, it's about inviting our leaders to work with their emotions, not against them. I like to ask leaders that I work with, what is the weather inside? That internal weather forecast. For me, currently, I just checked in. Did you hear that? I am sunny and I am clear. There's an urgency, like I know there's weather coming, and I feel a need to move quickly. This simple check-in invites us to notice our emotional state throughout the day. I can share 3 approaches, if you would like, that have surfaced from my leaders in my inclusive coaching practice. First, radical acceptance, truly embracing that all emotions are valid and meaningful. This is especially important when working with anger, which is often the first emotion that surfaces for many people. The second that has surfaced is the HALT framework, is what I call it. It's been so valuable. When emotions feel overwhelming, checking in with basic needs can reveal what's really happening. So HALT is an acronym. Are we hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? These fundamental states can amplify emotional responses. And third, personalization is everything. Rather than subscribing to universal techniques, our clients discover what works for their unique neurological makeup. For some might need to stim. For others, it's pressure techniques or movement breaks, joy breaks. As we wrap up today's exploration of inclusive emotional intelligence, I want to bring us back to our 3 key insights. First, different brains process emotion differently. Many neurodivergent experiences of emotions can be more intense, yes, immediate, and sometimes overwhelming in ways traditional EQ models don't fully account for. Second, emotional intensity in leadership is a strength. It's not about suppressing emotions, but working with them as valuable sources of information and creativity. And you know what? Also, connection. And this brings us full circle to where we started. Our bias about what's professional can create invisible barriers for our leaders, for women, for people of color, for anyone whose emotional expression doesn't fit the conventional norms. By expanding our understanding of emotional intelligence, we actively dismantle these bias and create more inclusive leadership spaces. I would love to continue this conversation with you. So keep reaching out to me. Share your thoughts on today's episode and tag me if you want to share them on LinkedIn with your big takeaways. And that's a wrap. We did it. Oh, next episode, we're diving into empathetic leadership. I didn't have the bandwidth to tackle that in this episode this week. So, next time, we're going to talk about that kind of power. Thanks for tuning in. Bye. Boom! Shakalaka! And that is a wrap on this episode of the Inclusive Leadership Coaching Podcast. If something in today's conversation got you thinking, I would love to hear about it. Connect with me on LinkedIn or at terrydonahue.com. And hey, if you're enjoying this podcast or you really want to support me, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review, and stick around. There's plenty more to come. Next time, we'll dive into even more exciting conversations. Until then, keep leading with inclusion in mind.